The Nick Scott Effect. The Nick Scott Effect. Available everywhere podcasts are found.
It's not easy. I feel the things that I felt anymore. And I won't dare just to hang my head. You know I can. My hands are tied.
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for doing this on last minute notice. Our good friend Burke Allen got us in touch with one another. And I knew you were a client of his for quite a while. And I had asked him about having you on the podcast, and I think some schedules kind of didn't line up for both of us. I had a cancellation this evening, and I said, is Colonel Collins available? And he said, let me check. And then he wrote me back, and you were. So this is awesome. I'm so excited to talk to you, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Where are you at? I know you had mentioned my time. Are you on the West Coast? Or
I'm on Central Time. I'm in Texas, San Antonio. I lived in Houston for 20 years, and we moved here. We moved here about 10 years ago. It's my husband's hometown, so we've, not too far from Houston. I can still go back there when I need to, but it's nice to be kind of out of the big city. Although San Antonio is a big city itself, but I'm away from a lot of the pollution here.
Well, you hear a lot these days about Austin. Like Austin is just blowing up. Are you far from Austin by chance?
I'm only an hour away. Both of my kids are in Austin. I have one in college up there and one is working, and they love it. They love Austin. Yeah. It's really a great place for young people, and there's a lot of businesses moving into Austin. And it's a great place to get a job. It's growing too fast. That's the problem. The area around it, it's just too much growth. I mean, it would be nice if they just slowed it down. But the area, the hill country of Texas is gorgeous. I love it. There's a little bit of a water problem here. We tend to have droughts. But other than that, it's a pretty safe place to live.
That's awesome. Well, to start things right off, I love Texas, so it's cool that you're there. We used to go down when I was a kid. My dad was a minister, and our youth group used to go to a small church, and we're talking 20 years ago, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was in Beaumont, Texas. So we used to drive down to Beaumont. We'd go through Louisiana, New Orleans, and everything through there. So I have fond memories of Texas and staying down there for 2-3 weeks in the summer and having a lot of fun.
Yep, I know Beaumont well. I used to fly in and out of there, and back when I was an astronaut in our little T-38.
Oh, okay, yeah. So let's talk about that. How you are a member of such a small, select group of people, and that are astronauts that have been outside of our atmosphere, that have been into space, that have looked down on this planet. That is just wildly intriguing to me. How did that happen? As a young girl, did you just inspire to, or what made you decide that I want to be an astronaut one day?
Yeah, well, I can answer that question on a couple of different levels. Now, as a kid, I read a lot of books about airplanes. I read magazines about astronauts. There were no really books on astronauts back then, but the Mercury program was taking place. The first time I remember learning about what an astronaut was, I was in 4th grade. And I was reading about them in a magazine and decided that's what I wanted to do. Go figure that one out. But I realized, looking at their backgrounds, that they were in the military, they were pilots, they were test pilots, and they were engineers. They had all gone to college and, majored in some type of engineering. And so I just thought that's what I was going to do. There were no women back then as astronauts, but I just thought I'd be a lady astronaut, and I kind of set my course to do that. Oh, and one other thing I should add is about reading books. I read a lot of books about pilots, the military, flying, exploring. I read a lot about science fiction, and I did connect the astronaut program to to some of these crazy science fiction shows. I don't know if you remember Buck Rogers, but I watched reruns from the 1950s of that when I was a little kid. So I actually have no idea what that was. But now I remember Buck Rogers, and if you showed it to me today, I'd be clueless. But I remember that I watched that when I was a kid.
Sure. That's incredible. So, my wife's family are military aviators as well. My father-in-law just retired this year as a CW5 for the West Virginia Army National Guard. He flew, I believe his career started in Huey's, and then at the end of his career, he was in the U-860 Black Hawk. He did medevac and a few other things. My brother-in-law followed in his footsteps and does the same. So they're rotary wing helicopter. So aviation is very close to home with us, and especially with my wife. So how did you start your path? Did you go to college and then flight school, or I'm sorry, you went to the Air Force and then on to flight school?
That's right. So I actually wanted to fly airplanes. And by the way, you know, it's great to hear you talk about your family and their military service. Before I answer your question, I just want to say one thing that I think is really important. Being in the military has been so good for me. It's increased my confidence. It's presented challenges to me that I honestly never thought that I would be able to do. You learn to work as a team and come together and complete these challenges. And I'll tell you, it's just, it was so good for me overall. It was good for my physical health, my mental health. I loved having a mission, which for me initially was I learned how to fly and then became an instructor, teach other people how to fly. So it doesn't have to be a career for everybody. In fact, not everybody is right for the military, but for people that think they might want to go in, it's a great place to get started in your life, in your career life. Sure. And but you know, back you had asked me about becoming a pilot and becoming an astronaut. I really don't know why that got locked into my head. Part of it might be because I grew up in Elmira, New York, where there's the National Soaring Museum is there. So soaring, gliders. And when I went to summer camp as a kid, I'd watch these gliders flying overhead. I never flew in one of them until I was in my 20s, but I always wondered, oh God, that looks like something I'd want to do someday. And so that was one thing. My dad took us to the airport, and we would just like watch airplanes take off and land. You know, we'd go to the glider field and watch the tow planes take the gliders up. And so, you know, that might have set the seed. The other one is my mother took us to the library, and that's where I eventually found books on flying, and I would read about what pilots did. And to me, this was a passion. And it was, once I got into high school and I started seeing that the reality of it, that there weren't many women pilots, and the ones that were there were few and far between, I started wondering, is this something that I can really do? If I tell someone I want to be a pilot, they're just going to laugh at me. So this kind of like festered in the back of my mind for a long, long time. And by the time I was 19 years old, I decided, my dad always said to me, don't just follow the crowd, do what Eileen wants to do. And so, his words would echo in my head, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go out and learn how to fly. I had to raise all the money myself from part-time jobs, but I saved up my money.
Oh, wow.
And I went up to the airport and took a lot of courage, but I went up to the airport and asked them if they'd teach me how to fly. This little fixed-base operator that, they had 2 instructors, and I think they had 5 airplanes, and learned how to fly. And even though I was not that good I was not much of an athlete in high school, but I could fly an airplane. And I started flying. I was actually 20 by the time I took my first lesson, where I was actually flying myself. And I realized, wow, I can actually fly. I could do the maneuvers. I could do the landings. I learned pretty quick. I soloed out, I think maybe a month or so after I started flying.
Wow.
So it was something that I could do well, and it was something I was passionate about. But, if I had just, I tell young people, if I had just gone with the flow of what the culture expected me to do, I don't think I ever would have become a pilot. I mean, I would have had a great career somewhere else. I think I would have been a teacher, or I would have, I probably would have gotten married and had 8 kids or something like that. But I think that for some reason, this burning passion to learn how to fly made me, I want to say, have the courage to break out of the peer pressure and do something different, if that makes sense.
That's amazing. I love that. And that's something I try to, and excuse me, throughout our interview, my allergies here in West Virginia, I don't know how it is in Texas, but pollen is terrible here, so I apologize. But my daughter is 9, going on 10, and I love hearing you say that because that's something I try to instill in her as well. Don't follow the crowd. Be a leader, and or just do what her name's Addison. Do what Addison wants to do.
Yep.
You know, if you love dance, do dance. If you love to play guitar, let's get lessons. If you want to play softball, let's be the best softball player you can be. You know, and I think more girls and women need to be encouraged of that because it's so easy in this age of social media for all of us to follow the pack, as it were, instead of kind of branch out on our own and do what we want to do, what we feel passionate about doing.
Well, I will say when my dad told me not to follow the crowd, he was not that soft. He would say more, it was more something like this. If all your friends jumped off the Walnut Street Bridge, would you jump off the Walnut Street Bridge? And it was, I mean, he was tough on me. I'm not saying that's the right technique, though.
Well, sure. But, and also I want anyone who's listening to this to understand just how amazing and tough your path is. And in knowing the military, like I know the military, to make it to colonel is alone a tremendous feat. I mean, there's a lot that goes into making it to that rank in any branch of the military service, from schools and classes and OCS, you know, officer candidacy, weekends, weeks, being selected, your different service, whatever. I mean, there's a lot that has to happen right for anyone to make it to rank of colonel. So, I mean, kudos to you. That is amazing. And thank you for your service, by the way. But then to also be an astronaut and then command a space mission. I mean, it's, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, stroke your ego or anything, but that's incredible. I mean, that is so incredible and so rare. So take me to when you made the decision that I'm going to go, and I mean, do you apply to be an astronaut? How do you ask?
Well, I think so. Being in the military, you have to apply to your service. So I was in the Air Force, so I had to apply to the Air Force, which had a selection board leading up to NASA's selection board. So the Army would have their own selection board, the Navy, the Coast Guard, etc., would each have what they called them a screening board. So you had to get through that. And they might have, you know, back in my day, maybe 150 applicants, and the Air Force would screen you. And it was mostly, it had more, honestly, it had more to do with, can the Air Force let you go? Are you in a career field where they can afford to give you up to NASA? So there was a lot of that going on, but I made it through that board, so I had to apply there first, and then those names get sent on to NASA. Now, if you're a civilian, you apply directly to NASA. You go to USA Jobs, you go to that website, and you just fill out the application, which is not easy. I mean, there's a lot they need to know about you before they can call you down for an interview. But, you know, you're talking about making colonel, and, you know, I think in the military, there's a lot of, we'd say, you know, a lot of buttons to push. Mm-hmm. You pretty much have to be getting your advanced degree. You have to go to the service schools. Nowadays, they want you to get a joint service assignment. So there's a lot of that going on, which, you know, I think that some of that is good, but I'm not sure if I think you can have too much of that. The important thing that the services are looking for is what is your career field? Is this something that is needed? In today's cybersecurity is a big thing. So, you know, if you're in cybersecurity, maybe you might have a better chance of being promoted. Or if you are, you know, in a career field that is currently needed or they don't have enough people, you have a better chance of being promoted. So, you know, those things are going on, as well as a person's leadership ability. You know, this is something that's evaluated by your boss, and your communications ability. So there's a lot that goes into that, and much of it is out of our control. So I never let these things go to my head, and I think it's really bad if you, you know, have too big of an ego, because I think that holds a person back. I think it's very important for a leader to be listening, to be constantly asking their team members, how are things going here? You know, what are the problems? How do you think we can do things better? Let's talk to each other. I can't do everything that you're asking me to do, but, you know, we can't do everything, but we need to talk about everything. So there's a lot of things that go into, you know, being being a leader and then being at a place where you can be promoted. And then the higher you get, when you start getting into general officer, it gets a lot more political. And I never got that far, because once for a military person who stays at NASA, you can be promoted to colonel, but that's pretty much it. If you want to go to general officer, you need to go back to your respective service, and that's something that I never did. I stayed at NASA pretty much until I retired.
That's amazing. So when did you get the call that you were being interviewed or selected to be an astronaut?
Well, that was great. Well, the first call is to come and do the interview. So I did that there were 5 groups of 20, so that was spread out over a couple of months. And then we all knew that the call was going to come sometime in the middle of January. And this was in 1990, when I was in the class of 1990. Well, it turns out they decided to call all of us on the same day that the first class of shuttle astronauts was called 12 years earlier, and that was January 16th. But I didn't know that, so I'm up flying.
Oh, wow.
I'm up flying I think I was in an A37 that day, doing spins and whatever I was doing. And I was all worked out and sweaty, and I came back, and there's one of those yellow government, I'm going to call them telephone notepads, with a message, call Dwayne Ross at NASA. So I'm like, oh, that's it. So I called him up. My heart's beating. I'm in the administrative office. There were no cell phones back in those days. And the admin sergeant is sitting there watching me, and she knew that I was calling NASA to see if I got into the astronaut program. So I call up, and I was Eileen Collins returning a call for Dwayne Ross, who was the board administrator. And the secretary handed me off to Dwayne. Dwayne handed me off to another person, who handed me off to John Young, who was an astronaut who walked on the moon, Apollo 16.
Yep.
And he says to me, do you still want to come to Johnson Space Center? And I said, well, yes, sir, I do. And then he went into this long discussion about, okay, we have simulators, and we have T-38s that you fly, and we have these classes and these facilities, and we have these mock-ups, and he's going through all of the things that astronauts do in training, but he never actually told me that I was being selected.
That would be killing me.
And I get to the end of the call, and I said, well, how am I going to ask him? But I kind of knew, because John Young, because of his stature and who he is, he told the ones that were selected that they got in. And then other people had to call the ones that weren't selected. There was pretty much the other astronauts on the selection board. So I kind of knew it was a good sign that I was talking to John Young. But at the end of this long, 5-minute dissertation of his, he said, do you have any questions? And I said, well, yes, sir. I go, am I coming as a pilot or a mission specialist? Because, by the way, I had applied for both. And he said, oh, pilot. You're going to be our first woman pilot. And then I knew that, yes, I was going. And it was almost like a huge weight off my shoulders. I thought that I would jump up and down, be happy and, have a big party, and none of that. It was like a huge weight off my shoulders. And they also told me to not say anything until the announcement went out the next day. So I told my husband, and I called my parents, but that was pretty much it. And anyway, so it was one of the best days of my life, because, I was 30, I think I was 33 years old at the time, and this is something that I had wanted to do since I was 9 years old.
Wow, that is incredible. I can't imagine the feeling you had that day. I can't imagine you sitting on the phone with John Young, all hearing this whole spiel going, come on, dude, just tell me if I made it or not, So I've always wondered, because, I watch the liftoffs, and, when the astronauts go up, even the SpaceX programs, when they do these unmanned test launches or whatever. But, I've always wondered, the only way in my mind, somebody who's never been in this position, is like when you're in the queue to go on a really fast, really crazy, really scary roller coaster, you have that anxiety. You have that, oh my gosh, you're about to do this thing. What is it like when you wake up and I'm about to be strapped into like a 20 million pound bomb and be just rocketed to space? I mean, was there butterflies? Was there a lot of anxiety, or were you just pretty calm and and just ready to roll.
Yeah, I would use the word focus. And there's it's almost like going through a checklist, and it's very important to have that, because if you don't, you're going to get anxiety, or you're going to get butterflies, you get nervous, whatever. You're not going to be comfortable. So we stay very regimented on launch day. I mean, there's a very specific time to the minute that you wake up, you go down to the suit, you get suited up. I mean, depending on when your launch is and, how your daily schedule goes, because it's different for every flight. But every little 5-minute block of time is scheduled out. And, you have a meal, and of course you want to make sure your equipment is correct. You've got to have a weather briefing. And you're going to talk about, what's the current situation on the space station. There's a lot of things that you're going to go through, but it's very regimented and it keeps you focused. And as the commander, I want to make sure that my crew is focused, and I don't want my crew to be nervous either. So it's good to have some humor in there. And, maybe you don't want to be playing practical jokes on launch day. We tried to do that and it didn't work, but it's good to have some humor, just mild, low-level humor. Keep the smile on your face. And as a commander, it's very important for me to be confident when I go out there, and to, make eye contact with my crew members as we go through, getting on the bus. We ride out, back then they called it the Astro van. We'd ride out to the launch pad. And then you're going through a very specific regimen. You're going up the elevator. Everyone's going to get in a certain order. You've got the closeout crew that straps you in, and then you've got checklists to run. You're checking your life support equipment. You're, for me, throwing switches, talking to the launch control center. You're watching the clock count down. At any moment, there could be a scrub. So you have to be ready either way for, right down to T-0. You could scrub, and then you're off into a different checklist. And the other thing that helps keep the astronaut from getting anxiety is all the training that we do. We actually do at least one practice strap-in at the launch pad in the actual orbiter. And prior to that, we do a lot of suit-ups and strapping in the simulator and going through those checklists. So I think it becomes kind of I don't want to use the word routine, but it becomes like a procedure. We're going through a procedure step by step to keep you focused.
Yeah, that is incredible. Thank you for explaining that, because I've always wondered, because I would be a wreck. But like you said, if you got your mind focused on the 5-minute intervals, what I got to do, what I got to do, what I got to do.
What's next? What's next? What's next?
Yeah. So while you're sitting in there, you're strapped in, you're facing up. I've always wanted to know, this is probably a really dumb question, something I could probably Google, but I never have. Are you the one hitting ignition, or is it mission control hitting ignition when you're taking off?
Yeah, it's actually the computers that do it.
Oh, wow.
Everything is programmed. Now, there are places where, very specific places, where engineers in the Launch Control Center can stop the launch. And this happened on my third launch. We were T-8 seconds, and one of the main propulsion system engineers saw what he saw was a hydrogen leak in the back of the orbiter where the engines are. So he actually pushed the button to stop the launch. But and so we ended up going into what was called a recycle, and we went out and we tried to launch again 2 days later. But they can stop the launch. But as far as pushing a button to make it go, the software does that. Oh, and by the way,
that's amazing.
The commander can also stop the launch. I have a switch over my head. It doesn't go directly to stop the launch, but if I throw that switch, it goes to the NASA safety officer. He's got his eyes on that, and if he sees me stop the launch for, maybe I've got somebody sick or something bad is happening on board, they can stop the launch in the Launch Control Center.
Wow, that's incredible. That's amazing. And not to bring up a disaster, a very sad disaster, but Challenger, it was the Challenger disaster. That was a hydrogen leak, correct?
Yeah. So
am I remembering that correct?
That was similar, but what it was, so on ours, the hydrogen leak was liquid hydrogen that fuels the main engines. What Challenger was those white rockets on the side. They're actually separate, but everything's bolted together. But one of those white rockets had a leak in a joint. So these things, they're like 4 stages that are bolted together. And then there's O-rings that kind of keep the hot gases from leaking out. Well, in Challenger, they had hot gas leaking out in one of those joint areas, and it was coming out like a blowtorch. Well, that blowtorch just happened to be going right at the fuel tank where the cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen was. And that blowtorch is what caused the fuel tank to explode.
Oh, my God.
So the leak in the F compartment that we had was different from that Challenger one, but still it could result in a disaster. So you want so the person that actually stopped the launch got an award for making a split-second call like that, but it turned out it was not really a hydrogen leak. It was a sensor that just went off scale high. And so they just had to repair the sensor. And why it happened at that point in time might have been because of all the shaking going on, but that thing just boom, went off scale high. So he made the right call, but it turned out that there was no leak. Thank you very much.
Well, sure. I mean, thank God he would rather be safe than sorry.
That's right,
you know?
Exactly.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Appalachian Outpost. They're located in Lyburn, West Virginia. If you're familiar with where Logan, West Virginia is, it's knocking on the doorstep right there. And we're talking about, for a third year in a row, the Summer Shindig. This year, happy to announce, country superstar Joe Nichols is going to be performing live at the Summer Shindig, July 22nd, at the Appalachian Outpost in Lyburn, West Virginia. Now, the cool thing about this is it's an absolutely free concert, so bring your family, bring your friends, bring your coolers, bring your lawn chairs, whatever. Drive down and make sure to hang out to see Joe Nichols live. We also got my friend Kate Boytek, who's a friend of the podcast. She's going to be performing, and for a third year, yours truly. So I'll be opening the show, creating some party vibes in between Kate and Joe when they play. So it's going to be a lot of fun. You can grab more details at AppalachianOutpost.com for the Summer Shindig with Kate Boytek, yours truly, and country superstar Joe Nichols. So that moment at T-0, when the rockets engage, ignition, and you start to lift off, what does that feel like?
So there's what we call a twang. So is the main engine start, T-minus 6 seconds, the liquid engine start, and you kind of tilt forward, and then about 3 seconds later you tilt back, and then at T-minus 0 the boosters light. And when the boosters light, these hold down posts are released, and you lift off. So there's a little bit of a jerk when you lift off, but it's actually quite smooth initially. You know you've lifted off because you can feel it. It's not a big jerk or anything, but you feel the lift off, and of course you can hear it. It sounds like you're in a room on fire. It sounds like you're burning around you. And then as you clear the tower, I mean, you're accelerating very, very fast. You can feel yourself being like pushed back in your seat. The shaking starts, and when you go through the jet stream on the way up, the shuttle is trying to keep itself in a certain attitude. It doesn't want to be like slammed around. So as it's trying to hold itself in the attitude and the wind is blowing it, the thrust vector control, TVC we call it, will start slamming around. It's called rock and tilt. That will shake the entire stack, and your head's like slamming around. And I always tell people, if you tried to write, you'd never be able to read it because it'd be a big sloppy mess because of all the shaking that's going on. And it turns out in the winter, when the upper level winds are very high, you get a lot more shaking than when you launch in the summer, which I've had 2 summer launches. They're a lot smoother, but you still have the shaking.
Oh, wow.
Probably the most overwhelming thing that happens to you is the acceleration. So you're being pushed back in your seat. I like to explain it as, imagine you're sitting in your car and you hit the accelerator and you're thrown back in your seat momentarily while the car accelerates. Well, in the shuttle, that's a constant acceleration. So you're thrown back in your seat. 3 G's, a G of, is a unit of gravity. So a good way to compare it is like if you were weighing yourself. So if you weighed 100 pounds on Earth and you could stand on a weight scale for a shuttle launch, it would register 300 pounds at the peak of the acceleration. Wow. So you got that much force, and it's going in this direction because you're laying on your back and you're going up. So the acceleration goes this way. And It's pretty interesting. You're being hurled into space, is what I can say. I am being hurled into space. Yeah. Meanwhile, all this shaking is going on, and the shaking is just in first stage. So when the boosters separate, it gets a lot smoother, but you're still being accelerated, and you can still hear the sounds. And the last really eye-opening thing that happens is about 8.5 minutes. The main engines shut off, and the computer sends a signal to shut them off at a very specific microsecond, and everything immediately starts floating. You've got, your tethers are floating, your checklist pages are floating, the ring, you got a helmet on, so that thing starts floating up around your neck. You start floating up out of your seat, and dust everywhere. Like this dust, it's just really eerie. And especially if it's a night launch, because you'll have lights, and then when the sun comes up, you'll see all this dust floating around. It gets cleaned up after a while. Once the fans get going, the filters will clean all that dust up. But in one time, we had a mosquito that we took into space with us. So I thought that was a Florida mosquito went up into space. And he didn't live very long.
Can you imagine what that mosquito was thinking the whole way?
Yep. He didn't live very long.
Oh, poor thing. Well, explain to me when you're going through, and I believe I'm saying this right, so I'm going to get my little NASA on, max Q, right? Not max pressure when you decelerate as you're going through. So what is the purpose of that? So you're minimizing the pressure on the rocket itself at a certain altitude, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, so Q, the small letter Q, like Q is in Queen, the little q is the engineering symbol for dynamic pressure. So the point of maximum dynamic pressure, or max Q, is the point where you have the most stress on the entire stack. And that would be, the shuttle, the boosters, as well as the fuel tank. And most of that stress is at the attach points, where the boosters are attached to the tank and the orbiter is attached to the tank. So we want to minimize that because you don't want to overstress the orbiter. It's certified to go into that region, so it's not like we're worried about anything, but I think it's more of a lifetime. You don't want to overstress the thing because it's a lifetime issue, because these orbiters were reusable. Sure. So we would throttle down. So you'd lift off with all three engines up at 100%. So I don't remember exactly what time, but about a minute or so we would throttle down. And that was to relieve some of the pressure. And then you go through max Q. And once you go through max Q, you throttle back up to 100%. And the throttle down is about 1/3. So you go from 100 to maybe 67%. And then go through max Q, the high dynamic pressure, throttle back up. And then you can actually feel that thrust when these throttle back up, which is all programmed. The software does the whole thing. You can actually feel yourself, again, being hurled into space is what I say. But it's quite a ride. That was going to be my next. I got to admit, it is quite a ride. And there's no way to 100% practice that on the ground beforehand. We do part task trainers, like you'll train a centrifuge, you train a motion-based simulator, and you can train in, like we have an airplane that we train in. But it all comes together on launch day.
Wow. So can you feel, you were talking about when you lift off and those G's are pushing you back, do you feel a release in pressure when you go through max Q and then back into it when it takes off again? Yeah,
I think at least the way I remember it is when you start approaching max Q, we have throttle down. And there's so much shaking going on, I don't really remember anything with the throttle down. But I do remember the throttle up, you're getting a kick of acceleration as you throttle up. And the other thing that happens that a lot of people don't realize is the shuttle doesn't go straight up all the way to space. It actually, and this applies to other rockets too, like the Falcon 9 SpaceX rocket that's flying now and the other rockets. You lift off, you go into a roll program. And the reason, you've heard the roll program called. The reason you roll like that is you are heading out over the Atlantic Ocean, because you're getting away from land for safety reasons, but also you're positioning the orbiter so you have communication with the satellite, and that you get the right, as we mentioned earlier, pressures on the orbiter. But as you go up, you're also pitching down. And by the time you get about 2/3 of the way up, which would be maybe around 5.5 to 6 minutes, you're not going up anymore. You're kind of going this way. And then when you approach 7 minutes, you actually dump your nose down and you're going down. And the whole purpose is to get to orbit. You want to put the nose of the stack down a little bit to gain energy, to gain airspeed. Put the nose down, get that speed, and then just before main engine cutoff, you pitch up a little bit because you want your vector going up. You can tell the difference between whether a rocket is going to orbit or if it's going suborbital, like just up and down in like a 10-minute flight. Those rockets can go straight up and come down. If you're going to orbit, you must go into the horizontal to get speed. And that's how, if you see a trajectory of a launch, you can tell if they're going to orbit or not. And I remember back in the early days when North Korea started launching these rockets, like nobody knew what they were doing. But if you understood how, the aerodynamics and the astrodynamics of launching, you can tell they were trying to go to orbit because the way they're pitching down. They're pitching down trying to get that speed so they can orbit the Earth.
That is so incredible to me that we, as a human race, have so many smart individuals over the last, 50 to 100 years that have figured all this out. You know what I mean? And it's just incredible.
So many of the early, back in the Gemini program, they were trying to figure out how to do rendezvous in orbit. So Gemini had this unmanned, like a drone, called the Agena. And the Gemini astronauts would go up in their Gemini capsule, and they would try to rejoin with these Agenas. And you had to prove, how does rendezvous work? How does orbital mechanics work? So these pilots would they would do it like an airplane. They'd look at their target and they'd add power and they think they're going to go right at it. But no, that's true for an airplane. You add power, you go right at it. If you're in space and you add power, you're going to go up. And that's called a posigrade burn. And these guys had to figure that out. That was a surprise to them. Like, why are we going up? Like, why is my target going under the nose of the spacecraft? A posigrade burn, it's going to raise your apogee or your perigee, depending on where you are. And then a retrograde burn is when, like, you're going this way, but you burn the engines into the direction you're going, and it makes you go backwards. That's a retrograde burn, and that will drop you down. So it doesn't really slow you down that much. It more or less drops you down. So all of this did not make sense to a pilot who has, you have habit patterns and expectations. The way an airplane flies, it flies differently in space. So when we do rendezvous, for example, when the shuttle rendezvous docked with the space station, and today we have the Dragon capsule from SpaceX rendezvous and docks with the space station, the computers help us figure that out. And on shuttle, we had a program called RPOP, Rendezvous Prox Ops Program, and we would use that to help us determine, like, which way and those were hand flown, which way do we burn, in, out, right, left, up, down. You would use your RPOP computer to help you with that. Today, that's all autopilot. Everything is done on autopilot.
So, did you pilot docking with the space station? Were you the one at the control trying to make sure that was right?
Yes. In fact, every docking on the space
this whole
shuttle,
conversation makes
it's
this whole conversation makes my anxiety go through the roof.
So in the space shuttle program, which went for 30 years, right, from 1981 through 2011, every docking with the Mir space station and the International Space Station, the commander hand flew the docking, the rendezvous and the docking. Wow. So you have 6 degrees of freedom, so you fly through these 6 degrees of freedom, and then when you get very, very close to the space station, you want to dock, you want to control your speed 0.2 feet per second, because it's very slow. When those two come together, it's very, very, and when you get about 2 inches away, I just fire one little pulse into the hand controller and get the two to, like, make pretty firm contact, and then the hooks and the latches pull the two spacecraft together, and then we equalize the pressure and open the hatch, and you can go back and forth between the two spacecraft. But all of that was flown by hand in the shuttle program. Nowadays, it's all done automatically because computers have come along. Why train
Sure.
pilots to do all that if the computer can do it? Although I believe pilots are still, the commanders and the pilots are still trained to do backup hand flying in case the automatic system is not working. And that's true for the Russians also. The Russians do the same thing.
So how many space flights did you do in total? Was it 3? Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, I flew 4. I flew 2 as a pilot, and then I flew 2 as commander.
Okay. Wow. And what was your longest stay in space?
So my longest was 15 days. So the space shuttle astronauts, which is what I did, we flew usually between 5 days and 20 days was about the length of our missions. Today on the space station, and I've been on the space station, but I was there because I was taking up a crew member, or we're taking up one mission, we were taking up a crew member, another mission, we're just taking logistics and experiments and bringing all their stuff back. But those long duration astronauts are up there from 3 months to a year, depending on, there's a lot of factors that go into how long you're going to stay up there. But in the shuttle program, I flew a 5-day mission, 8-day, 9-day, and a 15-day mission. So it varies depending on what you're doing.
Would you ever consider, if they called you up and say, ma'am, would you like to go for one more ride? Would you go?
Oh, I think about that all the time. I actually have dreams about that. If I will go up again. I don't know. The problem is, I would love to fly again, but the training for every mission is a massive commitment of your life into that training.
Sure.
And it's not easy. I would say the learning part is maybe the easiest, but the hard part is you go through this because we're doing things for the first time. On all of my missions, some of the things had been done before, but there's a lot of things that happen that have never been done before. So you've got to go through these decision-making processes, and we're talking life or death in many of these cases. So you really want to make sure that you're making the right decisions. So there's just so many meetings and so many decisions that need to be made along the way, as well as your training and making sure that you are prepared to make sure this mission is successful and to ensure the safety of the mission and the safety of the crew.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed having the challenge, and I enjoyed the decision making, but it takes a lot out of you. It really does. And if you have a family, you've got to split that time with your family. So I think it's good to do that for a period of your life. So I was an astronaut for 16 years. And during that time, I had my 2 children. I flew my first mission. My daughter was born. I flew my second mission, my third mission, and then my son was born. And then I flew my last mission. And at the end of the 4th, I thought, I think I'm done, because we had 50 astronauts. This was, I want to say we were about 5 years from the end of the shuttle program. We had 50 astronauts that hadn't even flown one mission yet. And I'm asking myself, do I need to stay here and fly a 5th mission if they'd even give me one, when we have all these young astronauts that haven't had their chance to go yet? And so I left and decided I would do something else. But I'm still in touch with, I have been an advisor to the National Space Council, the NASA Advisory Council, and I've done what else have I done? The Aerospace Science and Engineering Board. So I'm staying involved over the years, and helping the programs make decisions. And I think it's more important for our country to have more astronauts that have flown maybe less missions than to have just a few astronauts that have flown 5, 6, 7 missions. You want to be able to spread that skill around, that knowledge around between a lot of people, because that's more helpful, I think, to our space program overall.
How did it make you feel when you heard they were ending the space shuttle program?
Yeah, so I'd actually have to say that I was part of that decision. The decision was made by our country at the highest levels, but our office, the astronaut office, which at the time was very large. There might have been about 100 of us. Today there's only like 40 astronauts, but back then we had about 100 astronauts, and we hired too many, actually. But we were actually asked, what do you think we should do? And what really came out of the astronaut office was fly the space shuttle until the space station is built, because the shuttle was able to take those large modules up and to take large quantities of experiments and logistics and, just pack the space station full of everything it needs. And the other thing that we did is we took up a lot of spare parts and just stored them on the outside. So the spare parts would be there in the future in case something failed. So we just stocked up the space station. At the end of that time period, you really don't need the shuttle anymore, because all you're doing now is doing crew swap outs. You're changing out the astronauts, and you're changing out experiments, and you bring back the garbage, and you take up like food and clothing and things like that. So we didn't really need the shuttle. The shuttle had 2 accidents. It's a risky design, although it was a very versatile design, and we learned a lot from it. And I think it was a hugely successful design personally, but it was too expensive. Sure. You just can't keep flying the shuttle at that high expense and at risk. So we all decided in the astronaut office that we would like to see the shuttle replacement to be something similar to Apollo. Just a rocket with a capsule on the top, and put the crew on the top. And some of the benefits from that, you remember the Challenger accident, that was during the launch. They did not have a crew escape system. They had no way to get ejected out of the fireball. But with the capsule on the top, like the rockets we have today, if there is an explosion, you can eject the crew off the top, and the capsule will come splash down, and you save the lives of the crew. So that's one benefit.
Wow.
But the other benefit to having a rocket design like Apollo, when you think about what caused the Columbia accident, they had a hole in their heat shield. Because remember, the shuttle kind of hung down low, and any stuff that fell off the stack could hit the heat shield. If you have a capsule on the top, your heat shield is protected. That is the design we're flying today. So you have a crew escape system, and you have a protected heat shield, much safer than the shuttle design. And spaceflight is still risky, but I think that the rockets that they're launching today are much, much safer. Just in the essence of their design, they're much safer.
Do you feel it's the right decision to go with a private company like SpaceX versus taking it out of kind of NASA's hands?
Yeah, so that's the question. So far, so good. I was a little bit maybe doubtful at first, because the private companies, their goal is to turn a profit, right? So NASA's goal was to, we're going to fulfill the mission, but with the money that Congress gives us. We still had 2 accidents, and a lot of the causes that went into that accident were blamed on the fact that, maybe we were going too fast, or we didn't have enough money. There were a lot of reasons that went into those accidents. And you want to make sure that if you turn over the ownership and the operation of these rockets to a private company, that they learn those lessons that were made back in the early days, and that they're searching, their goal of turning a profit doesn't encourage them to do something that's too risky. So I've watched this as months and years have gone by. These companies know if they have an accident, it could be completely over for them. So they do not want to have an accident. And they're very, very, from what I've seen, I don't work for them, but I've talked to their employees. Mm-hmm. From what I've seen, they are doing a pretty good job so far. And these rockets that blow up, they're all part of the development process. And obviously there's no one on board. But by the time you got to make that decision, are we ready to put astronauts on board? That's where, and by the way, NASA is involved in that. With we've got SpaceX, we've got Boeing, and then there's some other private companies that are also launching people. And there's a whole risk management process that they go through to make sure that it's ready and it's safe.
Yeah, I watched the most recent launch where they put the what they call it, the super heavy or whatever on top, and it looked like a successful launch. I mean, the one guy said they were just happy to clear the pad, but it went into like a weird space.
Yeah,
It
so
was the one they just did like last week.
That was April 20th, and I was watching the launch. That the Super Heavy is the name of their first stage, and then the payload on the top is called the Starship, and that Starship that's a prototype for the Starship that's going to land on the moon in 2025 or 2026. So, but what they had up there was just a prototype. But true that they were. I don't know what their mission objectives were, but yes, they did get off the launch pad. But there were several issues. One of them was they saw that the stage separation never happened. So that Starship was supposed to separate from the first stage, and it never did. And the thing started pitching around. And apparently we know now that, so they have a self-destruct system, and apparently it's automatic. Well, it was late. It didn't blow it up until like 40 seconds later than it should have. So there's a lot of things that they need to figure out what's going on there, and maybe in the next couple months we'll know something. But
as I was watching it,
go ahead.
As I was watching it, I was listening to their commentary, and they said we should see separation. We should see separation, and I'm like, oh, something's not going right. And then you were talking about the pitch. Well, you saw it pitch down, and then it just started to roll. And I didn't know that was self-destruct was 40 seconds late. I wonder as it started to roll and kind of spin if that self-destruct had already been initiated and it was late and then it eventually blew up.
So I don't know the answer to that. I thought it exploded because it exceeded its structural limits, and it certainly, after it had done a couple of flip rounds, it exceeded its structural limits, and something would have broken. And when it breaks and you release all that fuel, you're going to have an explosion. But then I heard afterwards that the self-destruct system actually is what caused it to explode. But I don't think we're 100% sure of that yet. But I'll tell you, that it was I mean, people are still talking about it. This is like a historic moment in spaceflight because there's a couple other things going on there, too. It's a new launch site. It's down there in South Texas. They were trying to launch without a flame trench, for the space shuttle, we had this really deep trench. So when the engines lit, all of the exhaust would go down into the flame trench, and it would shoot out both ways. They didn't have a flame trench down there on South Texas. And the other thing they didn't have is there's a water deluge system. So in the shuttle, what we learned after the first space shuttle launch, there was all this damage on the launch pad. Well, some brilliant engineer said, we dump a bunch of water on the launch pad while it lifts off, and that will minimize the damage. And somehow, don't ask me how it works, but somehow that works. Well, SpaceX doesn't have a water deluge system. I mean, it costs, it's going to cost a lot of money to put in a water deluge system, but it works. So I'm not sure what they're going to do. But clearly, that 33 engines is going to cause a huge, and all that weight that they're lifting off is going to cause a lot of debris to be flown off, to be ejected all over the place.
Well, I know you had mentioned that you have to leave by a certain time, and we're closing in on that mark. And I don't want to forget about your book. Your book is incredible. I have it pulled up here on Amazon. I want to talk a little bit about it. Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars, the story of the first American woman to command a space mission. How incredible. And there you are, all suited up, looking just, may I say, badass.
It's also
and this you can grab. It's a paperback, hardback. And you can grab this, I'm sure, at all your favorite bookstores. But tell us a little bit about the book, what you put into the book, and what readers could find.
Well, I decided to write the book when the pandemic hit, because all of a sudden my travel stopped, and I had some extra time on my hands, and my co-author, Jonathan Ward, who has written three previous books, had been asking me about writing a book. He goes, let's do it together. And it wouldn't have happened without him. He kept me on schedule, like, let's go, let's go, let's keep. So I would write a chapter, and, I started out with what it feels like to launch into space. That's my opening chapter. And then from that point on, it's my memoirs, like, growing up, what inspired me to be a pilot growing up, then what it was like to join the Air Force, what I did in the Air Force, what it was like to be an instructor. I was in the first class of women to go through pilot training at my base in the Air Force. And there were 4 of us, wow. And so I talk about that. And I stayed on as a T-38 instructor pilot. I was the only woman T-38 instructor pilot for 3 years. And actually, I loved it. I loved working with the guys. We all had a great time. And, because you're also doing a fairly risky job. So you want to make sure that you have procedures, you have rules, you have safety mechanisms in play to make sure that you don't want anybody to get hurt, because flying is inherently risky. So I talk about that
absolutely.
A little bit. And then I flew C-141s. I went into a combat zone in Grenada back in 1983. Talk about how I applied to the test pilot school, what it was like to be a year at the test pilot school, application to the shuttle program, astronaut training, and then the 4 missions that I flew. And throughout the book, I have stories on lessons learned. So I'm not like, some people write books and they just brag about every perfect thing that they've done. But I thought, no, that's not me. I made mistakes along the way. I had challenges. I had to make decisions. I had, frustrations along the way. Things didn't always work out the way I wanted it to. So I talk about that. And I think talking about mistakes that were made by me along the way and what I learned from them and how to prevent that from happening again. So I try to weave that in the book. And hoping that people, if you read the book, maybe you don't want to be an astronaut yourself, but I think you can learn something from it. And I hope the book will also encourage young people to consider the military or the space program as a career option for them.
That's incredible. And kudos for you for doing it. And I love to hear that kind of was born out of the pandemic, because that's how my podcast started, was out of the pandemic. I spent 15 years as a live radio personality and then went into satellite radio and so forth. And I also have an entertainment business. And when the pandemic hit, all of our bookings and everything we were doing just stopped. And I was like, what am I going to do with myself? So, and then this podcast really took off, and our mutual friend Burke Allen's been a great supporter. Well, ma'am, I was going to have my daughter stop down and say hi to you because I think you are a tremendous inspiration to young women everywhere. And let me see if I can't get my wife. I bet my wife didn't have her phone on her. I sent her a text just a second ago. I said, send my daughter down. And I'd love for you to say hi to her if you have just a few extra moments.
Is she in 4th grade?
Like I said, third grade.
Third grade. So, okay.
Let me see if my wife will answer. 9 should be 10. Hey, can you send Addison down? Oh, she's right here. All right. Sorry, I was hung up on your mommy. No, she's in PJs. Come here, honey. This is Miss Eileen Collins. She was a colonel. You know how your papa was in the military and retired? Well, she was a colonel. But here's the thing. Here's something really cool about Miss Collins. She was an astronaut. She went to space 4 times. She was the first American woman to command a space mission. How cool is that? You want to say hi?
That's me.
Say hi.
Hi.
Hi, it's Addison. Is that you? Well, I'm very nice to meet you. What do you like to do in
ask
school?
Her anything? She has just a little bit of time left.
I like to do science and stuff.
What was that?
So what's your favorite science?
My favorite science?
Speak up.
I have a soft, mellow voice sometimes. My favorite thing is science in school, and my most favorite thing I like to do in science is probably like the exploding science experiments. The ones that explode.
Oh, so your favorite is, did you say your favorite subjects is science and you like things that explode?
So her favorite subject is science. You got to speak up into this mic, honey. Her favorite subject is science, and she loves doing the science experiments where they mix things and they explode or whatever. You got to speak
You know
up
what? That sounds just like what I said when I was your age.
So when she was about your age, read a book about becoming a pilot, and she's a pilot like your pawpaw. And she went in the Air Force, and then when she was done with the Air Force, she also wanted to be an astronaut and applied, and they hired her, and that's how she went to space. So she, I believe, is a great example for young girls like you that you can do whatever you set your mind to.
That's right.
Really cool.
You can do whatever you set your mind to. So while you're in school right now, you should, do your coursework, do your homework, and along the way, you're going to find something that you're really passionate about, that you really want to do. And listen to your parents too. Listen to your teachers. So there's a lot to
I don't know if you heard her because my mic isn't picking up really well on her voice for some reason, but she said, I think you're really cool.
Oh, well, thank you. But you know what? The other thing that's really important is reading books.
I like reading books. It's just COVID made
Speak up.
COVID made me fall a little bit behind.
So we have been playing a little catch up with her reading because of COVID, but she's doing phenomenal. She's doing a great job.
Yeah.
Well, Colonel Collins has to run. Is there anything you want to say real quick before we say bye?
Whenever I'm older, I really want to become a doctor.
Perfect. That's great. And you could actually be a doctor astronaut too. We actually have many doctors in the astronaut program. And we also have doctors in the space program, and they're called flight surgeons.
So you could be a doctor and a pilot like Colonel Collins and Pawpaw was. How cool would that be? All right. Well, you want to say bye? She's got to go.
You are adorable. I think we must be getting ready for bed now. Well, it was very nice to meet you, Addison.
Very nice to meet you too.
Oh, I pulled your hair. I pulled her hair. I'm very sorry.
Wow,
well, thank you so much for doing that. I'm sure you touched her tonight, so I appreciate that.
Oh, that
Colonel
made me
Collins,
very happy.
Please. Awesome. Thank you. It made me very happy as a father. Hey, I know we're up against the clock here and you got to run. The next time there's a big shuttle launch, or maybe when we're heading to the moon, or if you just want to come on and you're writing another book or whatever, please reach out to me. You are welcome on this program anytime you would like.
Yeah, we can talk about going to the moon. I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me on your podcast and asking. Those were great questions. It was really interesting. Thanks.
I'm